Thank you for joining us at this webinar on Globus for High Assurance Data Management. Here are some of the topics I'll be covering over the next 30-40 minutes. I'll start off with an overview of the product offering and some of the eligible services within the Globus ecosystem that can be used with protected data. Then I'll go on to talk a little bit about Globus Connect Server version 5, which is a new major version, and that is what is required for using Globus for protected data management. Then the key part of the presentation is around the high assurance features that are provided for managing protected data, and then I'll do a demo of those features. And then I'll talk a little bit about installation of Globus Connect Server and Globus Connect Personal, just provide a high-level overview of that, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So with the new product offering, you can use Globus for handling restricted data, whether it's PHI, PII, or controlled but unclassified data. And to be able to do this, we have worked with the University of Chicago's security office, and we've got Globus to be compliant with these NIST controls, 800-53 and 800-171 low. So the hosted service now applies all these security controls, and so you can use Globus for managing the protected data. Further, we also are worked with the University of Chicago security office to get an ATO to operate in an environment that allows us to sign business associate agreements. So if you are using Globus in an environment that is HIPAA regulated, then you can sign a BAA with us, and the University of Chicago in turn has a BAA with Amazon because Globus is completely operated on AWS. Now, Globus has never seen file contents, so it continues. That's the same model that continues. So when you use Globus for managing your data, data moves from source to destination. When you share data, again, we never see the contents of your file. The other piece of restricted data that Globus does see is file paths and file names. So with this new product offering, you can have PHI or protected data in file paths and file names. We see that when we manage your file transfer. So for example, if you're transferring a large directory, then Globus does an LS and stores all the file path names for duration of the transfer. Similarly, when you share with someone else, you might provide us the path information to say what you're sharing with someone. So that is a piece that can now have protected data in it. No other elements in the Globus system can contain protected data. So if you're creating endpoints or you're creating labels, then you cannot add any protected data in those pieces. So it's really the file paths and the file names. Of course, the file contents can have it because we never see it and it's encrypted. A subset of the Globus services are now available as high assurance eligible services, which means these are the only ones that can be used for protected data. In a nutshell, this is anything that you would use to do transfer and sharing. So Globus Auth, which is our fundamental security piece, that is part of this, transfer, groups, DNS, and sharing. For protected data management, you also would use the new web app. We recently released app.globus.org as our new web application, replacing the old web app that is currently available. For protected data, you would use the new web app. There is also two new versions, one for Globus Connect Server 5.2 and Globus Connect Personal 3.1. And both of those versions are the ones that support protected data handling. And then, of course, the Globus CLI, the Python application CLI, is also available for use with high assurance collections. We continue to add a few other features in here. For example, the first one we will be adding is AWS S3 connector to this, so that you can use that with high assurance data. And we will continue to add other connectors into version 5. The Globus Search service, which is right now available as a platform service, will also be added into the high assurance eligible services. However, there are a set of services that will not get moved over. Globus ID, the one with which you create a username password with Globus, that is not going to be a part of high assurance, so it cannot be used for protected data. The data publication SaaS that we have, the old web app, any of the GCS 4 versions or the GCP, current version of GCP that 2.x cannot be used. Of course, the hosted CLI was discontinued as of August 1st of this year, so obviously that is not a part of the product offering. So I've referred a lot to Globus Connect Server version 5, which is a new major version. So I want to spend a little bit of time going over that because I'm going to refer to it as I go through the demos and how you can deploy Globus for protected data in your environments. So Globus Connect 5 is a major version change from 4. There is another webinar about a month ago where we talked a lot about the motivations, the point versions that have been released, and so on if you're interested. So this was motivated by trying to get to meet some of the newer use cases that we have, cleaner interfaces and separation of interfaces and so on. We've been doing point releases. The first one was support for Google Drive. Then we supported some POSIX collections along with HTTPS. And now 5.2 is a support for high assurance. So you would use Globus Connect 5.2 for managing any protected data. We plan to continue these point releases to add various features. 5 has some additional features that 4 does not have, but we also need to get feature parity. And at one point, we will release a version of 5 and provide migration scripts. So you'll be able to move all your 4 endpoints and everything into the new 5 ecosystem. Right? Now, with 5, there is a terminology and architecture change. So I want to walk through that a little bit here. So let's start with how the building blocks look like. The first one, just data transfer nodes, right? All the institutions have data transfer nodes deployed. This could be in your Science DMZ or any other server that you have provisioned for moving data in and out. So Globus Connect Server is installed in each of the data transfer nodes, and the endpoint becomes a logical structure on top of these various nodes. That provides all the management and configuration interface. So anything that talks about managing your servers, anything that talks about network parameters, so really what an administrator would use for managing the endpoints. So that's the endpoint piece. Then the next thing you would add are connectors. These are the pieces of software that are required for talking to a particular storage system. So here are the examples. There's a POSIX connector, which now can talk to a POSIX storage system. Once you have that, the new construct in 5 are storage gateways. So storage gateways are really a point in the storage system along with policies on how to access that, right? So a logical part of the storage system with policies. So in this example, you see for the same POSIX storage system, we have 2 storage gateways. One is rooted at /project, and it has some policies that governs how it can be used. Another one is rooted at /scratch, and it has some additional policies on how it can be used. Right? So with 5, you can also have multiple storage types. So I could, on the same DTN, so I could also drop in a Google Drive connector and have another storage gateway that is specific to the Google Drive connector. So up until here, the management of servers and management of the gateways is all in admin function, and all the interfaces here are about policy, configuration, and users should never see any of this. Then on top of this comes collections, which are really the data access interface. So, and this is what the users use to access the data on the storage system. And we support both grid FTP and HTTPS protocols for this. Right? Now, there are 2 types of collections. So the first one is mapped collections, which is really where you need a local account for access. And then you have guest collections, which is where you don't need a local account and you can share data with other users on those collections. So with 5 and this layered architecture, we're drawing a clean separation between what a user sees and what an admin sees. And we also see additional benefits of being able to reuse the same DTN pool for multiple storage systems, logically dividing your storage systems based on policies and so on. Now, for those of you who have 4 deployments, here are some of the changes, right? So host endpoints today are called mapped collections, and you need local account to access the data. Shared endpoints are called guest collections, and there is no local account needed to access the data. the permission is set and managed in Globus. You would use host endpoint to create a shared endpoint today. So that's where it's rooted. In the new model, you would use a storage gateway to create guest collections. And then finally, with 5, you have both GridFTP and HTTPS access to the data with the same security policies, right? Whatever permissions you set and authentication requirements, they apply however you come in and access the data. There is a document which in our docs.globus.org website, which has details on all this terminology, the architecture, explains motivation. And there's also a webinar from June that's available for you to look at that talks about version 5, its motivations, and also does a walkthrough of the installation, which has a slightly different model from 4. So if you're interested more on this one, these are the resources for you to take a look at. Now, we've looked at 5. So you have Globus Connect version 5, and 5.2 is what you need for protected data. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the high assurance features that we provide for protected data. So we build on the security features that Globus already provides around federated identity, fine-grained access control management for sharing data, linked identities for convenience, and users being able to share with entities as opposed to knowing a specific identity and so on. So these are all basic security features that Globus already provides and layers on your local security. I'm going to only talk about the additional features that are built on top of this for handling protected data, right? So the first one I'm going to talk about is authentication assurance and additional authentication assurance. So when an admin sets up a storage gateway, they can flag the storage gateway to be something that handles protected data. So you call them high assurance storage gateways. When you do that, you can then also specify an authentication assurance timeout. And Globus will require that the user authenticate with a specific identity that grants them access within the authentication timeout interval and within a session. So essentially, we are increasing the requirement on the authentication, right? So let's unpack this a little bit. So let's say the user is has logged into the Globus web app using their Argon identity in this example, and they're accessing a collection. Now, when they access a high assurance collection, it's going to throw an error saying this high assurance collection has a very specific identity that you need to have authenticated within a particular time frame here, right? Globus automatically redirects the user to their login. So the user authenticates with the University of Chicago credential, and they have access to the high assurance collection, right? Now, like I said, there is an authentication timeout. So which means if the user hasn't authenticated within that timeout, they would have to authenticate again for continued access. Now let's see what this looks like in a example flow, and I will demo this. So let's say you have a collection, a high assurance collection at UC Med, and the admin has set a timeout of 4 hours. Now, the administrator here has an access manager role, which means they can grant permission for other people to access the data on it. So you have another user who has multiple linked identities, University of Chicago identity, a UC Med, and then a Gmail, right? The admin grants them read access, saying this user can have read access on that high assurance collection. If the user then gets an email, that's how Globus sharing works, and the user authenticates with an identity, for example, their Gmail, access will be denied. And the user will be redirected back to their UC Med identity because that's the policy on this HA collection. And once the user authenticates with that, they will have the permission to access the data, right? So essentially, we are enforcing a very specific identity within a timeout, within a session. Now, the next step, let's say the admin wants to manage and update the rights for someone else. She wants to grant read and write access. The same authentication assurance requirements apply. The admin will be forced to re-authenticate with UCMed identity. And once they do, they can grant permissions. Right? Now let me demo this here. So I'm going to open up my app. This is the new Globus web app that is hosted at app.globus.org. And I'm going to go to the HA high assurance demo collection that has been set up. So let's go to one that is here. Notice here, it tells me that I need to authenticate with the University of Chicago credentials. I've logged in with my Globus one. It wants me to authenticate with that. So I click on that. I go to the University of Chicago. I log in with that one. And now I should be able to see the collection, browse the data in the collection. Right? Now this one is set up with a 10-minute authentication timeout. So after 10 minutes, I'll be forced to log in again to do this, right? So if I go to the one of my collections here on that endpoint, and if I click on the permission panel, you can see that I have given my other Exceed identity read access on this, right? So this is my Exceed identity has read access on this collection. So on another private browser here, this is another window. I'm not logged in. Let's say I log in with my Argonne account. And this is linked to my Exceed account in Globus. So I log in with my Argonne credential and attempt to access that shared collection. So the collection to which I was given permission. So I go back here. Let's see, shared with me. I see this collection was shared with me. And you notice here this lock that tells me it's a high assurance collection. So I click on this. I notice it says permission denied. Is you have to have authenticated with Exceed within this session. So I click on Exceed. And once I do, you'll notice that I have access to the collection. Because my Argonne and Exceed was linked, Globus was able to work with the user, sort of take them through the flow and let them know which particular identity they have to use to do this. So now I have access to the Project One folder. Now in about 10 minutes, if I come back to this to this collection, I would be asked to re-authenticate because the timeout would have been reached and I'd be asked to re-authenticate, right? Yeah, so let's go back to the slides here. The second high assurance feature is application instance isolation. And what this really means is the authentication context, that is the fact that you authenticate with a particular identity, is all in the context of a single application and within the session in that application. So even within a browser, if you open multiple applications that use Globus, the authentication context is isolated, right? So let's take an example here. You have a user who's accessing a high assurance collection, and they've logged in within that application using their UChicago, so they have access to it. Now they open the high assurance collection with a new app in the same browser, right? So this is a new application that uses Globus. So we have, because Globus is a platform, many people can run client applications. So let's say we have another one, essentially that is treated as a whole separate secure authentication context, and the user is asked to re-authenticate as their UChicago identity. And the same is true if they come in using the CLI, right? It's a whole nother application, and it requires you to establish context all over again, independent of the fact that you have logged in to the same endpoint or the same collection using the right credentials. Essentially, there's no shared global context there on this. So how does this help us? If the user is authenticated on app 1, the user authenticates on app 2, but if one of the app gets compromised, then the attacker has no means to get access to the first app, right? So the attack is isolated to the single application. So I'm going to demo this using the CLI, right? So on the browser, so you saw I had just logged in. This is well within 10 minutes, so I still have access to this, right? But let's say I want to go to this endpoint on the CLI. So if I try to do, let me first show you so if I do a Globus, who am I? On the CLI, you can see I've logged in with UChicago, right? Now I do an LS on that endpoint on a collection to look at it, and it's going to tell me that I need to re-authenticate. The way I can check is if I do a Globus session show, it's going to show me that I did log in with UChicago, but that was well over 10 minutes ago. So my authentication assurance timeout has been reached on this application, although I have it valid in this application. So I can run Globus session. This essentially is going to prompt me to log in again as UChicago for the CLI. And once I do, and if I do a session show, you will see an updated timeout here. Let me do this one again. You would see an updated timeout right here. So now if I do an ls, I should be able to see the directory. So this demonstrates sort of the app isolation concept. So it is a CLI that is completely independent from the web app. Okay. So now then that's the second big piece of this. The third one is encryption of user data in transit and Globus data at rest, right? So Globus has always been able to encrypt data, the data channel, and it was a user choice or an admin choice. So you could set a flag that said encrypted for privacy reasons. But when you set up a gateway as a high assurance gateway, all the data that ever is transferred in and out, automatically everything is encrypted. So it's not up to the user or the admin anymore. It's just enforced, right? And then we also encrypt everything at rest in our hosted service. So I talked about the fact that we have, transaction information. Some of the file paths are stored. There is data that is stored at rest in the Globus service. All of that is completely encrypted to meet the requirements of the protected data handling, right? And then the last one is detailed audit logs. So if you go look at your data transfer node that is running 5.2, for any high assurance collection access, you will see very detailed logs that let you reconstruct everything that happened, how was access granted, which data was accessed, and so on. So there's sufficient information on your DTN for you to reconstruct all of this. So most of my focus, the 4 big features, was around transfer and sharing, but the same policies apply to anything that is used in that context. So for example, the group service is used in Globus for providing permissions to data. So you could share with a group, or you could do read access to a group, write access to a group, and so on. So the group service has an additional option now. And if you look at the settings, it's called the strict option, which essentially means that this group is used for high assurance data handling. So apply all of the things that I just talked about, right? Additional authentication assurance timeout, app isolation, additional logging, and all of that. So it essentially will force the user to do those extra security pieces when using this group. There are also some group feature changes because of that. Invitations can only be issued by admins or managers, so users can invite people. Subgroups will automatically inherit those policies, and so on, right? So when you are using groups in the context of high assurance guest collections, then you should be choosing this option and setting an authentication timeout. So you're forcing this. It's the same thing with management flows. So if you are using the management console, for example, to look at logs or pause transfers for anything that is high assurance, the same rules kick in. So you would be forced to authenticate with the specific identity that grants you the access manager or the access monitor role within a session. Anything to do with gateway or collection configuration, all of that will force the same set of security policies. So the high level statement there is anytime you are accessing data that is protected or anything that could lead to protected data access, so changing permissions and so on, all of that will require that you authenticate with this. Something that we have been very careful about in all of this is to ensure that users who are not using high assurance data collections don't see these additional security restrictions. So their user flows and user journeys remain as it is today, and it's very streamlined and friction-free, but only when there is a need to force additional logins, then that kicks in. So it's all per collection, per gateway, per session. So it's very isolated. So let's talk for a couple of minutes about what you have to do as an admin, right? So if you are setting this up on your campus, you have to install Globus Connect Server 5.2. And the installation flow looks a little different from the version 4. So we still provide all the binaries. So you would do the same steps. You would download the binaries from Globus and install it on your DTNs. But you don't use a Globus ID anymore. So you would register the endpoint that you're installing at developers.globus.org. It becomes a client to the Globus auth service. And through that registration process, you end up getting the credentials you need to manage that endpoint. So you get what is a client ID and a secret to manage that endpoint. Once you have that, you can add the storage connector. So if you're doing a POSIX gateway, then you would add the POSIX one. If you're doing Google Drive, you would add that one, and we'll keep adding support for other things. Once you have the connectors is when you start adding storage gateways. So you can pick the part of the storage system that you want to expose as a part of a gateway. You can create these gateways. You can set policies on the gateway on who can access it, what type of collection you want to support. Is it mapped or mapped and guest or guest only? You can also set high assurance flag right there and configure the authentication assurance timeout. If you're supporting mapped collection on a gateway, that's an admin function. So you set up a single mapped collection with a policy on how the mapping is determined. How do you go from the identity someone logs in as to the local account? Do you configure that and set up that mapped collection? So once you set this up, when users are looking to use a mapped collection, they just come in and log in and access the data. If they are looking to do guest collections, they could potentially create new guest collections themselves on the storage gateway if you have allowed it, or they could just access guest collections that somebody has given them access to. The next one is Globus Connect Personal. We have a new version of Globus Connect Personal for high assurance data handling. The key use cases we see for these are sometimes managed laptops where researchers are allowed to download protected data to that machine, to that device. The other use case is instruments, data coming out of instruments, and the acquisition machine traditionally runs Windows, and so GCP is used. Now, the difference you would see with the new GCP is you would be asked to choose a particular identity from your set of identities to use with the endpoint. And once you do that, that identity is required to be in session for accessing the data. Everything else works the same. The installation is still very simple. We distribute binaries for all platforms. You'll just see an additional question when you download that says, is this GCP going to be used with protected data? And if the user says yes, they get the version 3 binary along with a drop-down that forces them to pick the identity that is allowed to be used with this. And then we also have additional logging, just like we did with GCS. GCP has enough logging for you to be able to do audits and such on that one. So now switching a little bit to secure operations. So I've talked a lot about what it looks like from a user perspective, a little bit about what it looks like from an admin perspective, sort of installing and make it available from your side. This talks about what Globus has done on the hosted server side, right? So we have done a bunch of updates to our hosted service to comply essentially with the NIST security controls. So intrusion detection prevention has been upped. We've had additional audit logging that we had to add. A lot of processes around configuration management and change control that have been more formalized. We've always had these, we just had to make them more formal. And we have heavily relied on AWS's best practices, right? So we have everything that you would expect in standards. So VPCs and security groups and monitoring to validate that we are complying with it and so on. So there's a whole bunch of work that has gone into the hosted service. And for all practical purposes, it is essentially the controls that NIST 853 and 71 outline, and we had to comply with that for this. Right? Okay, the last thing here, how do you get these features at your institution? We have 2 new subscription levels. So the first one is called the high assurance level, which essentially is an add-on to your standard subscription. And it's a 33% increase on your standard subscription for getting all the high assurance features. With that, you can set up as many collections or gateways as high assurance as you'd like, and all the additional security features I talked about is made available. But if you are operating in an environment that requires business associate agreement, for example, a HIPAA regulated environment, then you would go into the BAA tier which gives you all the features of the high echelon tier plus a BAA with the University of Chicago. And that's a 50% uplift on the standard subscription. In either of these cases, if you're a current subscriber and we end up providing a separate subscription ID for you. So you will essentially see two subscription IDs, one for your non-high assurance use and then for your high assurance use. So, and then you can have separate subscription managers and tracking and so on. All the same features that you get with managing a subscription, regular subscription, you get with managing the high assurance one also. This is the last slide. It essentially gives you more pointers. So if you're looking for additional information on any of this, installation, introductory material, so the homepage for all of this is docs.globus.org. Specifically, there is a guide there called docs.globus.org high assurance. So I'll show you how to get there. Go to docs.globus.org. Under guides, you will see the high assurance collections for protected data. And this has a wealth of resources that tells you all about data handling, what are the services that are eligible, and talks about how to use Globus for protected data management. As always, if you have any questions, if you need help getting started, or you're looking to do an installation, need help, you can email us at support@globus.org. And then the last one I want to highlight is the way for you to subscribe to our blog posts, news, and announcements. If you go to globus.org, contact us. There's a way for you to subscribe. It's not a very it's a very low mailing list, so you only get informed when there's something important, but it's a great way to stay in touch. We announce product deprecation, new product releases, all of that information goes out through that channel. So it would be a great way for you to keep tabs on what is happening on our side of the house. Thank you very much.